Let me begin with a simple question that sounds innocent but isn't. How often do you feel that you understand something only to discover later that you never really did? It's a curious feeling. You're listening to an explanation, perhaps in a classroom, perhaps reading a book, and everything seems to fall into place. The words are familiar. The sentences flow smoothly. Your head nods along almost by itself. There's a quiet satisfaction in that moment, a sense that the work is done. But that feeling can be dangerous because it often arrives before understanding has actually occurred. To see why, imagine a student standing at a chalkboard. The board is filled with tidy symbols, each written carefully, as if neatness itself could guarantee meaning. The student explains each step fluently. Nothing seems wrong. Now ask a single question. Why does that step follow from the one before it? Suddenly the explanation slows. The confidence weakens. The words begin to repeat themselves. What looked like understanding turns out to be familiarity. Familiarity is not the same thing as comprehension. The mind is very good at recognizing patterns. If we've seen certain words together often enough, or heard a particular explanation repeated many times, we begin to recognize it the way we recognize a melody. But recognizing a tune does not mean you know how the instrument works. You can hum the notes without knowing why they fit together. This is why the feeling of understanding is unreliable. It tells you that something sounds right, not that it is anchored in your own thinking. Real understanding is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. Instead, it shows up when you try to use an idea and discover that you can move it around without it breaking. You can explain it in plain language. You can draw a picture of it. You can imagine what would happen if one piece were changed. If you can't do those things, then the idea is still fragile, no matter how confident you feel. This is uncomfortable, of course. Nobody enjoys discovering that what they thought they knew is thin. It feels like losing ground. But in truth, it's the opposite. It's the moment when thinking actually begins. Consider how we often learn definitions. A term is introduced, followed by a sentence that sounds precise and authoritative. We repeat it, we write it down. Perhaps we even use it correctly on an examination. But if you were asked to explain the same idea to a friend using only ordinary language, no technical terms, no special symbols, you might hesitate. That hesitation is important. It's a signal. It tells you where the understanding ends and the memorization begins. A mind trained for deep thinking learns to notice that signal and respond to it with curiosity rather than embarrassment. Instead of rushing past the gap, it lingers there. It asks, what is this really saying about the world? This approach requires a certain kind of honesty. You have to be willing to admit, at least to yourself, that you don't yet understand. Many people avoid this admission by hiding behind impressive words. They repeat the explanation again, perhaps more loudly or with greater confidence, hoping that certainty will somehow turn into clarity. But clarity doesn't work that way. Imagine reading the description of a simple machine, say, a wheel and axle. The explanation may describe how a small force applied over a large distance can lift a heavy load over a shorter distance. The words are clear enough. But until you picture the wheel turning, until you imagine your hands pushing along the rim, until you feel how the motion trades distance for effort, the idea remains abstract. You may think you understand it, but your understanding hasn't yet connected to reality. The danger lies in mistaking smooth explanations for solid ones. A well-polished sentence can slide through the mind without ever catching on anything. A rough explanation full of pauses and corrections often signals genuine thought. This is why asking simple questions can be so powerful. Not clever questions, simple ones. What does that mean? Why does it have to be that way? What would happen if it weren't? These questions disturb the feeling of understanding, and that disturbance is productive. It forces the mind to stop coasting and start working. There's another test that reveals whether understanding is real. Try teaching the idea to someone else. Not by repeating what you've heard, but by rebuilding the explanation from the ground up. When you do this, gaps appear very quickly. Steps you thought were obvious suddenly demand justification. Those gaps are not failures. They are maps. They show you exactly where to look next. So the first step toward thinking like a genius is not brilliance or speed. It's a willingness to be unsettled, to notice when understanding feels too easy, to treat that feeling not as a reward but as a warning. When you learn to pause at that moment, to resist the urge to move on, you give your mind permission to do its real work. And that work, though slower and sometimes frustrating, leads to something far more satisfying than the feeling of understanding. It leads to the real thing. Most people grow up believing that intelligence is measured by how many answers they can give. In school, questions are treated like hurdles. You clear them, and then you're done. The answers are the prizes, and once you have them, the thinking is supposed to stop. But this way of looking at things quietly teaches the mind a bad habit. It teaches it to rush toward closure, even when the situation doesn't deserve it. If you watch carefully, you can see this habit at work almost everywhere. Someone asks a question, an answer appears, and everyone relaxes. The room settles. The conversation moves on. But what often goes unnoticed is that the answer may not have explained anything at all. It may have simply replaced one mystery with a label. This is why questions matter more than answers. Answers can end thought. Questions keep it alive. Consider how a child first encounters the world. Nothing is ordinary. A door opens and closes, a sound echoes, a shadow stretches across the floor. Each observation invites a question. The child isn't trying to be difficult. The child is trying to understand. Every why is an attempt to connect what is seen with what is known. Over time, this behavior is discouraged. We learn that asking too many questions slows things down. We're told that's just how it is, or you'll learn that later. Eventually, we begin to accept explanations not because they satisfy us, but because they allow us to proceed. The questions fade, and with them, a certain sharpness of thought. A curious mind resists this fading. It treats every answer as a starting point rather than a destination. When an explanation is offered, it asks what assumptions are hiding underneath. What had to be true for this explanation to work? What would break if one of those assumptions failed? These are not hostile questions. They are gentle, patient ones. They don't attack the explanation, they explore it. Suppose you're told that something behaves a certain way because it follows a rule or a law. That may be accurate, but it's incomplete. A law describes a pattern. It tells you what happens, not why the world permits that pattern in the first place. Confusing description with explanation is one of the most common mistakes in thinking. A good question exposes that confusion. For example, imagine someone says, "The object falls because gravity pulls it down." The statement sounds explanatory, but notice what it has done. It has simply replaced the observation with a name. The real question, the interesting one, is what it means for something to be pulled and how that pulling occurs without visible contact. You don't need to solve the mystery to benefit from the question. The act of asking sharpens your understanding of what you do and do not know. It separates genuine insight from verbal comfort. Another important feature of good questions is that they slow you down. They interrupt the automatic flow of explanation and force you to examine each step. This can feel frustrating, especially in a world that values speed, but speed and understanding are often at odds. A mind that races from answer to answer has little time to notice when something doesn't quite add up. A mind that lingers on questions, on the other hand, develops sensitivity. It notices when an explanation is circular, when a definition depends on itself, when a conclusion was smuggled in at the beginning. This sensitivity is not a talent, it's a habit. There is also a certain humility built into good questioning. When you ask a genuine question, you admit that your current picture of the world is incomplete. You allow for the possibility that it might change. This openness is essential. Without it, thinking becomes rigid and new ideas have nowhere to land. It's important to distinguish genuine questions from empty ones. A genuine question arises from curiosity. It seeks understanding, not victory. An empty question is asked to impress, to confuse, or to appear clever. It leads nowhere because it wasn't connected to real confusion in the first place. The best questions are often simple. They can sound almost naive. What does that word really mean? How would this look if I could see it? What would happen if I tried the opposite? These questions work because they pull ideas out of abstraction and back into contact with experience. They demand clarity, not cleverness. One of the most reliable ways to tell whether a question is good is to see what it does to your thinking. If it opens space, if it leads you to draw diagrams, imagine alternatives, or test possibilities, then it's doing useful work. If it shuts things down, leaving you with nothing but a clever phrase, then it probably missed the mark. Thinking like a genius is not about collecting answers and storing them away. It's about cultivating a small, persistent dissatisfaction with easy explanations. It's about keeping questions alive long enough to teach you something. When you learn to value questions this way, answers take on a different role. They become tools rather than trophies. They are things to be used, tested, and revised, not things to be protected. And once that shift happens, thinking stops being a race towards certainty and becomes something richer, an ongoing conversation with the world, guided not by the need to be right, but by the desire to understand. There is a temptation, especially when learning something new, to begin with words, definitions, descriptions, careful sentences that promise to explain how the world works. Words are useful, of course, but they have a dangerous side. They can float above reality, giving the impression of understanding without ever touching the thing they claim to describe. That is why it helps to begin somewhere else, with the physical world. Imagine a wooden plank resting on a brick, set up as a simple lever. On one end sits a heavy weight. On the other end, your hands press down. The arrangement is unremarkable. You don't need training to see what happens. You push, and the weight rises. At first glance, it seems almost trivial. But if you stay with it, if you resist the urge to move on, you'll find that the situation is full of questions. Where did the lifting power come from? It's tempting to say it came from the lever itself, or from the cleverness of the arrangement. But that answer only shifts the mystery. The lever didn't create strength out of nothing. Your arms did the work. So what changed? If you pay attention, you'll notice that your hands move a long way downward while the weight rises only a little. Distance has been exchanged for force. Nothing has been gained for free. Nature allowed a trade, but she kept the accounts balanced. This idea that there are trades rather than miracles is a deep one, and it reveals itself most clearly when you build your understanding from physical intuition rather than from formulas. You can feel this trade in your body. Push harder, and the resistance pushes back. Adjust the position of the brick, and the effort changes. Move the fulcrum closer to the weight, and suddenly the lifting feels easier, though your hands must travel farther. These sensations are not distractions from understanding. They are the foundation of it. When ideas are rooted in experience like this, they become flexible. You can imagine variations without fear. What if the plank were twice as long? What if the weight were moved closer to the center? You don't need a rule book to explore these questions. You can picture the changes and predict the outcome. This way of thinking stands in contrast to learning that begins with symbols. Symbols are efficient, but they are also compressed. They hide the steps that give ideas their meaning. If you learn only the symbols, you may know how to manipulate them without knowing what they represent. That's a fragile kind of knowledge. Consider another ordinary experience. You push a box across the floor. It resists at first, then slides. You push harder, and it moves faster. You stop pushing, and it slows down. These are not abstract facts. They are felt experiences. Your muscles register effort. Your eyes see motion. Your ears may even hear the scrape of the box. From these experiences, ideas about force and motion are born, not from definitions, but from interaction with the world. If someone hands you an equation describing this motion before you've thought about the experience itself, the equation may feel mysterious. It may work, but you won't trust it. On the other hand, if the equation comes after you've built a picture in your mind, after you've noticed the patterns for yourself, it feels natural. It becomes a shorthand for something you already understand. This is why strong thinkers often draw pictures. They sketch arrows, blocks, wheels. They imagine invisible pushes and pulls as if they were tangible. These drawings are not childish. They are honest. They reflect a desire to see how things fit together. There is also a discipline involved in physical intuition. It's not enough to imagine freely. You must imagine carefully. If your picture allows something for nothing, if energy appears without effort, then the picture is wrong. The world is remarkably strict about balance. Every gain has a cost. even if that cost is hidden at first. Learning to respect that balance trains the mind. It teaches you to look for what's being traded, what tea's being conserved, what's moving from one form to another. These habits apply far beyond simple machines. They shape how you think about systems of all kinds. At the same time, it's important to admit the limits of physical intuition. Not everything can be pictured easily. Some parts of the world resist simple visualization. When that happens, honesty matters. You acknowledge that your picture is incomplete. You use it where it works, and you let it go where it doesn't. This humility keeps intuition from hardening into dogma. Building ideas from the physical world is not about rejecting abstraction. It's about earning it. You begin with experience, move to pictures, and only then introduce symbols as tools. When done in this order, the symbols feel light. They serve the understanding rather than replacing it. And once you've learned to think this way, you start to notice something interesting. The world itself becomes a laboratory. A door hinge, a bicycle chain, a swinging lamp, all become invitations to think. You don't need special equipment. You need attention. That attention, directed patiently at ordinary things, is what turns everyday experience into deep understanding. There is a quiet pressure that follows many of us through our education and beyond, the pressure to know, to have an answer ready, to appear certain. Uncertainty is often treated as a weakness, something to be hidden or quickly patched over. But this attitude misunderstands how knowledge actually grows. To think seriously, you must make room for not knowing. Consider how often people reach for confident explanations when they are not truly sure. They speak smoothly, they repeat familiar phrases, and the uncertainty disappears. Not because it has been resolved, but because it has been covered up. The mind finds comfort in closure, even if that closure is false. But real understanding is built in the open, where uncertainty is visible. Admitting I don't know is not an endpoint. It is a marker. It tells you where the edge of your knowledge lies. Without that marker, you wander past the edge without realizing it, mistaking borrowed certainty for genuine insight. There is a difference between ignorance and acknowledged ignorance. Ignorance is not knowing and not caring. Acknowledged ignorance is not knowing and being keenly aware of it. The second state is fertile. It invites investigation. It sharpens attention. Many of the most interesting questions lead naturally to this edge. Why do the rules of the world have the form they do? Why should motion, force, and time relate in this particular way and not another? At some point, explanations stop yielding further reasons. We can describe patterns with great accuracy, but when we ask why those patterns exist at all, the answers grow thin. It is tempting at this point to invent certainty, to dress the mystery in impressive language and pretend it has been solved. But that move trades honesty for comfort, a mind train. D for deep thinking resists that trade. Instead, it learns to live at the boundary between what is known and what is not. This boundary is not a fixed line. It moves as understanding grows. But wherever it lies, it deserves respect. One way to see the value of uncertainty is to notice how often confident explanations collapse under gentle questioning. Ask a few careful why questions, and you may find that the explanation loops back on itself or rests on an assumption that was never examined. Recognizing this is not a failure of thinking, it is a success. You have located a weak point. From there, progress becomes possible. There is also a kind of courage involved in admitting uncertainty, especially in public. It feels risky to say, I'm not sure, when others seem confident. But appearances are misleading. Many people sound certain because they have never examined their assumptions closely enough to notice the gaps. Confidence without examination is easy. Honest uncertainty requires effort. This honesty has an unexpected benefit. When you admit that you don't know, you free yourself from defending a position. Your attention can shift from protecting an answer to exploring a question. The mind becomes more flexible, more receptive to new information. This is particularly important when dealing with complex ideas. The world is not obliged to fit neatly into our explanations. Sometimes the best we can do is construct models that work within limited domains. They are us, evil, but they are not the final word. Recognizing this prevents confusion between the map and the territory. A model is a way of organizing experience. It is not reality itself. When a model stops working, the honest response is not to force it, but to adjust or replace it. This attitude, treating ideas as tools rather than truths, depends on comfort with uncertainty. There is also a personal dimension to this. Many people tie their sense of worth to being right. Admitting uncertainty can feel like admitting inadequacy. But thinking is not a contest. It is an exploration. Being wrong is not a defect. It is an inevitable part of the process. In fact, if you are never wrong, you are probably not thinking deeply enough. When you begin to see mistakes and uncertainties as information rather than threats, your relationship with thinking changes. You become more willing to test ideas, to push them until they fail, to learn from what breaks. This willingness accelerates understanding far more than cautious certainty ever could. Of course, admitting I don't know does not mean giving up. It means postponing judgment until there is reason for it. It means distinguishing between what you believe, what you suspect, and what you have good evidence for. That distinction alone sharpens thinking dramatically. There will always be questions that remain unanswered, perhaps permanently. Accepting this does not diminish the value of inquiry. On the contrary, it makes inquiry more meaningful. You are no longer chasing an illusion of complete certainty. You are engaging honestly with the world as it is. And when you adopt this stance, something subtle happens. The fear of not knowing loosens its grip. Curiosity takes its place. You begin to see uncertainty not as a gap to be hidden, but as an invitation, an open door to further thought. There is a quiet pressure that follows many of us through our education and into adulthood, the pressure to know, to have an answer ready, to appear certain. Uncertainty is often treated as a flaw, something to be corrected as quickly as possible. But this attitude misunderstands how knowledge actually grows. To think seriously, you must make room for not knowing. Consider how often confident explanations appear where certainty does not truly exist. Smooth language fills the space. Familiar phrases are repeated. The uncertainty disappears, not because it has been resolved, but because it has been covered over. The mind finds comfort in closure, even when that closure is artificial. Real understanding, however, is built in the open, where uncertainty is visible and acknowledged. Saying I don't know is not an admission of defeat. It is a marker placed at the boundary of your understanding. Without that marker, you wander beyond what you know without realizing it, mistaking borrowed certainty for genuine insight. There is a crucial difference between ignorance and recognized ignorance. Ignorance is not knowing and not caring. Recognized ignorance is not knowing and caring deeply. The second state is productive. It invites investigation. It sharpens attention. Many of the most interesting questions lead directly to this boundary. We can describe patterns in the world with great precision. We can predict how systems will behave. But when we ask why the rules themselves have the form they do, why these patterns and not others, the answers grow thin. At some point, explanation gives way to description. This moment is uncomfortable. It tempts us to invent certainty, to dress mystery in impressive language and pretend it has been explained. But this is a trade, comfort in exchange for honesty. A mind trained for deep thinking refuses that trade. Instead, it learns to live at the edge of knowledge. This edge is not a fixed line. It moves as understanding expands. But wherever it lies, it deserves respect. It marks the place where thinking is still alive. You can often locate this edge by asking a few careful questions. An explanation that sounds solid may unravel quickly when pressed gently. A definition may turn out to depend on itself. A cause may be nothing more than a renamed effect. Discovering this is not a failure, it is progress. You have learned something important about the structure of your own understanding. There is also courage involved in admitting uncertainty, especially in front of others. It can feel risky to say, I'm not sure, when confidence is expected, but appearances are misleading. Many people sound certain because they have never examined their assumptions closely enough to notice the gaps. Confidence without examination is easy. Honest uncertainty requires effort. This honesty brings an unexpected freedom. When you stop defending an answer, your attention is released. You are no longer protecting a position. You are exploring a question. The mind becomes more flexible, more receptive, more willing to change. This flexibility is essential when dealing with complex ideas. The world is under no obligation to fit neatly into our explanations. Often, the best we can do is construct models that work within limited ranges. They are useful but incomplete. Confusing a model with reality leads to trouble. Recognizing the limits of your models depends on comfort with uncertainty. There is also a personal challenge here. Many people tie their sense of worth to being right. In that frame of mind, admitting uncertainty feels like admitting inadequacy. But thinking is not a contest. It is an exploration. Being wrong is not a defect. It is a normal and necessary part of the process. In fact, if you are never wrong, you're probably not thinking deeply enough. When you begin to see mistakes and uncertainties as information rather than threats, your relationship with thinking changes. You become willing to test ideas aggressively, to push them until they fail, to learn from what breaks. This willingness accelerates understanding far more than cautious certainty ever could. Of course, admitting I don't know does not mean stopping. It means postponing judgment until there is reason for it. It means distinguishing carefully between what you believe, what you suspect, and what you have evidence for. That distinction alone can transform how you think. There will always be questions that remain unanswered, perhaps permanently. Accepting this does not diminish the value of inquiry. It makes inquiry honest. You are no longer chasing an illusion of complete certainty. You are engaging with the world as it actually is. And when you adopt this stance, something subtle happens. The fear of not knowing loosens its grip. Curiosity takes its place. Uncertainty becomes not a gap to be hidden, but an open door, an invitation to keep thinking. If there is such a thing as thinking like a genius, it does not begin with cleverness or speed. It begins with habit. The habits of mind you cultivate quietly shape the way you approach every problem, long before you notice yourself thinking at all. The first of these habits is slowing down. When faced with a new idea, most people rush toward a conclusion. They want to know what it's called, how it's used, and what answer it produces. But rushing past the beginning is a reliable way to miss what matters. A careful thinker lingers. They ask what problem the idea was meant to solve in the first place. They ask what was confusing before the idea existed. This simple act of slowing down changes everything. It allows questions to surface. It creates space for understanding to form rather than being forced. Another essential habit is taking ideas apart. Instead of accepting explanations as complete, you treat them as constructions. You examine the pieces, what assumptions are built in, what experiences support them. What would happen if one piece were removed? This kind of analysis is not destructive. It is exploratory. Like taking apart a simple machine to see how it works, you are not trying to break the idea. You are trying to understand it well enough to rebuild it. Rebuilding is the next habit. After you have taken an idea apart, you try to put it back together in your own words. Not the polished words from a book, but plain language that feels slightly awkward at first. If the explanation sounds clumsy, that's often a good sign. It means you are doing real work rather than repeating memorized phrases. A useful test is to imagine explaining the idea to a friend using only a pencil and paper. No special terminology, no shortcuts, just drawy NGs, gestures, and ordinary speech. Wherever the explanation stalls, you've found a place that needs more thought. This process naturally leads to another habit, testing ideas by changing them. Once you think you understand something, don't leave it alone. Gently disturb it. Ask what would happen if one part were larger, smaller, faster, or slower. Ask whether the idea still holds under these changes. If it collapses immediately, your understanding was brittle. Strong ideas survive being handled. This kind of testing does not require elaborate experiments. Many of the most revealing tests can be done in the imagination. You picture an extreme case and see whether the idea still makes sense. This is not guessing. It is disciplined imagination. Alongside these habits runs a quieter one, intellectual honesty. This means resisting the urge to pretend you understand when you don't. It means noticing when you are satisfied too quickly. It means being willing to say, even privately, I don't know yet. This honesty is not self-criticism. It is respect for the complexity of the world. There is also a playful side to serious thinking. Playfulness does not mean carelessness. It means freedom. You allow yourself to try odd approaches, to ask questions that seem naive, to explore without a clear destination. Play creates movement. Movement reveals structure. Many important insights come not from grim determination, but from relaxed curiosity. Another powerful habit is connecting ideas to everyday experience. Abstract concepts gain meaning when they are tied to things you can see, touch, or imagine clearly. A swinging lamp, a rolling wheel, a stretching spring, these become anchors for thought. When you build these connections, ideas stop floating, they gain weight. You can return to them later and find them still intact. It is also important to develop patience with confusion. Confusion is not an obstacle to thinking, it is evidence that thinking is happening. When something doesn't make sense, it means your current picture is being challenged. If you stay with that discomfort instead of fleeing from it, the picture often reorganizes itself. This reorganization cannot be rushed. Insight has its own timing. Over time, these habits reinforce one another. Slowing down makes it easier to notice assumptions. Taking ideas apart makes rebuilding possible. Testing ideas reveals their limits. Honesty keeps the process grounded. Playfulness keeps it alive. None of this requires exceptional talent. It requires attention and care. The result is not a mind filled with answers, but a mind that knows how to work. When such a mind encounters a new problem, it does not panic or reach for authority. It begins by asking clear questions. It builds understanding step by step. In the end, thinking like a genius is less about brilliance and more about integrity. You take ideas seriously enough to examine them closely. You take yourself lightly enough to be wrong. And once you begin practicing these habits, something subtle happens. The world becomes more interesting. Ordinary things invite inquiry. Questions appear everywhere. Thinking stops being a task you perform and becomes a way you live.